In last week's video, I told you the 3 true facts of Mulan and the history of the Northern Wei Empire that Mulan lived in. The Northern Wei early adopted Buddhism as their state religion. The emperors of Northern Wei started erecting the statues of Buddha carved near their capital, which declared the emperors as the representatives of the Buddha and the legitimate rulers of China. In today's video, I'll take you to Yungang Grottoes in the west of Datong left from the Northern Wei Empire. I'll tell you how elements from ancient Greece, Persia, and India ended up in this place.
Hello, I'm Yan Yan. Today I'm in Datong, Shanxi Province. I'm going to take you to explore a UNESCO World Heritage Site.
After entering the gate, I walked through 2 rows of columns. What do these columns stand for? You will find out the answer in a few minutes. After the columns, there is an island in the middle of a lake. The lake and the island are artificial, and the temple was newly built. It's said that the temple was built according to the description of the Yungang Grottoes in ancient Chinese geography book. The island is the only way to reach the grottos. Once I get ashore from the island, the grottos are getting close. The Yungang Grottoes are carved along the cliff of the Wuzhou mountain, stretching for about 1 kilometer from east to west. There are 45 main caves and more than 51,000 stone statues. The highest one is 70 meters high, and the smallest is only a few centimeters. The grottos can be divided into early, middle, and late stages. The early grottos are the 5 big Buddha statues in the middle. The carving started from 460 AD and lasted until 465 AD. The caves are numbered from 16 to 20. Beginning around the year 471 AD, in a second construction phase that lasted until 494 AD, the caves 5 to 13 were constructed under the supervision and support of the imperial court. Those are the caves in the east part. The imperial patronage ended in 494 AD when the Northern Wei shifted the capital to Luoyang. The caves 1 to 4, 14, 15, and the caves in the west part emerged under private patronage in a third construction period. The early stage construction was led by the famous monk Tanyao. Thus, caves 16 to 20 are known as the 5 caves of Tanyao. The central parts of the 5 caves have carvings of huge Buddha statues symbolizing the first 4 emperors and the crown prince of the Northern Wei dynasty. I'll introduce them one by one, relating them to the history of the Northern Wei Empire in last week's video, in which I talked about the Mulan story.
The Buddha behind me is the signature of Yungang. It used to be inside a cave, but the front of the cave collapsed, making the Buddha exposed.
The Buddha statue in Cave 20 represented Emperor Daowu. He was the founding father of the Northern Wei Empire. In last week's video, I told you that Tuoba tribe of the nomadic Xianbei people established their own state, but was conquered by another nomadic state. Emperor Dao was the one who led his tribe restoring their state and proclaimed as the emperor of the Northern Wei Empire in 399 AD. The Buddha statue in Cave 19 represented Emperor Mingyuan, who was the son of Emperor Dao. During his reign, Northern Wei's territory did not expand as much as it did under either his father's reign or the reign of his son, but he helped the state stabilize over northern China. The Buddha statue in Cave 18 represented Emperor Taiwu. He unified all of northern China in 439 AD. Northern Wei roughly doubled in size during his reign. Taking a close look at his statue, there are thousands of small Buddha statues in his cassock. Is there any meaning for that design? It's because he suppressed Buddhism during his reign. At the suggestion of his prime minister, and believing that Buddhists had supported rebellion against him, Emperor Tai ordered Buddhism abolished on the penalty of death. Some Buddhists were slaughtered. That was the first suppression of Buddhism in Chinese history. They carved thousands of small Buddha statues in his cassock to express the attitude of repentance. Let's skip cave 17 and go to cave 16 directly. The Buddha statue in this cave represented Emperor Wencheng, who was a grandson of Emperor Taiwu. It was him who ordered the construction of the Yungang Grottoes. 2 years before that, he officially ended the prohibitions against Buddhism that his grandfather had instituted. The Buddha statue in cave 17 represented Crown Prince Jimmu. He was never an emperor because he died before his father's death. But because he was the father of Emperor Wencheng, who ordered the construction of the Yungang Grottoes, he had a spot in Yungang. The 5 Buddha statues are similar in style, but not identical. Their similarity lies in their thick lips, high nose, big earlobe, and broad shoulders. If we compare the Buddha statues of cave 16 and 20, we can see the differences. The Buddha statue in cave 20 wears a monk's cassock, exposing the right shoulder. That's a style from ancient India. The Buddha statue in cave 16 wears a dress that's similar to what ancient Chinese wore, and there is a tie in the front. Also, the face of the statue in cave 16 is much slender. The differences reflected the Sino-Cessation process that was going on in the Northern Wei Empire during that time. Now, let me tell you what these columns are. They're actually the replica of columns of cave 9 and cave 10. Does it somehow remind you of the Parthenon in Greece? How did the ancient Greek columns appear in Datong in the 5th century? Thanks to an ancient country called Gandhara. Gandhara was an ancient region in the Peshawar Basin corresponding to present-day northwest Pakistan and northeast Afghanistan. It was conquered by Alexander the Great in 327 BC. Greek craftsmen and artists arrived in this region. It was then conquered by the Mauryan Empire. The Mauryan emperor would convert to Buddhism and spread religious philosophy throughout his domain. Kyrgyz Buddhism art style was formed. Following the collapse of the Mauryan Empire, Kyrgyz Buddhism continued to flourish. It then spread east to Liangzhou, a region in the Silk Road and corresponding to present-day Gansu province of China. In 439 AD, Emperor Taiwu unified northern China. The last state he conquered was the state in Liangzhou. He moved 20,000 civilians, including craftsmen, from Liangzhou to his capital Pingcheng, present-day Datong. Those people brought the Gandhara Buddhism art to Datong. Tan Yao, the monk who was in charge of the first 5 Buddha statues, was actually from Liangzhou. This is how the ancient Greek elements came to Yungang. Many elements from Persia and India can also be found here. For example, the honeysuckle pattern. Before, the majority of decorative patterns in China were auspicious beasts. The pattern in this one vessel from around the 3rd century BC is a dragon-like auspicious beast. So is the pattern in this container. Those were the mainstream patterns in ancient China. But ever since the honeysuckle pattern arrived in Yungang in the 5th century, it became a popular pattern in China, even in the Tang Dynasty in the 8th century. The midterm grottoes are in caves 5 to 13. Caves in the second stage carvings are made up of front and back chambers with Buddha statues in the center. Look at cave 9 and 10. The space behind the columns are the front chambers. There is a gate in each cave that leads to the back chamber. There are Chinese characteristics in the caves carved in the second stage. Usually it's the mix of Chinese and Western styles. Cave 9 is a good example. The gate that leads to the back chamber has a traditional Chinese-style roof. Above the Chinese roof, in the second story of the cave, there is a lotus ceiling, which is the traditional element in Buddhism. Above that, there are 4 figures holding the ceiling. They are believed to be the Atlas from the Greek mythology. This multi-heads, multi-arms figure is a character from ancient India. Let's take a look at another cave from this period. Cave 6 is one of the largest and richest caves in Yungang. There is a stupa pillar in the center of the back chamber extending from the floor to the ceiling. The tower pillar is divided into 2 stories. The Midterm Caves date back to when carving was at its peak in the prosperous period of Northern Wei Dynasty. Embossing covers walls and ceilings of the entire cave. Usually the statues depict stories in Buddhism. There are wooden buildings extend in front of Cave 5 and 6. These were constructed during the 17th century in order to preserve the caves. The late-stage grottoes were carved after Northern Wei shifted capital from Pingcheng to Luoyang. Although Cave 3 is not as big as the 5 caves of Tanyao, you can actually climb into the cave and take a close look at the Buddha statue.
In this daily is part of an article written by a famous Chinese scholar. It talked about what Xianbei and the Northern Wei Empire have brought to the Tang Dynasty. It might be the first time for you to hear about Xianbei or the Northern Wei Empire, but everyone should have heard about the Grand Tang Dynasty. And what does Xianbei have to do with the Tang Dynasty? In brief, the royal family of Tang Dynasty had Xianbei blood.
The grandmother of the famous Emperor Taizong was from a noble Xianbei family. Emperor Taizong's queen was Xianbei. Many people in the court and in the army of early Tang Dynasty were Xianbei people. The Xianbei people brought openness and diversification to the Tang Dynasty, which made it the center of the world culture between 8th to 10th century, and a golden age in Chinese civilization. You can trace all that to Yungang Grottoes. In 494 AD, amid strong opposition from the court and army, Emperor Xiaowen moved the capital from Pingcheng to Luoyang, a city near the Yellow River in the center of Chinese civilization. I'll tell you how he persuaded the court to move the capital in next week's video. A little spoiler, he was inspired by US President Donald Trump's book, The Art of the Deal, and used a strategy outlined in that book. In next week's video, I'll leave the 400mm isophite and go to the Yellow River region. I'll take you to visit the grottoes in Luoyang. I'm Yan Yan. I upload a video every Saturday about sites of interest in China and histories and stories behind them. Subscribe to my channel. I'll see you next week in Yungang Grottoes.